So it's a little bit the wrong sequence because, of course, Brasilia, should remind us of the heroic days. Yeah, okay. Okay, finally. So this should be a lesson for everyone. Just be 10 minutes before your lecture at the place where you lecture, because then you avoid some moments of excitement. Brasilia. The city in Brazil to talk about, I think it's the most complicated city to talk about. It has none of the problems that all the other cities have that you have seen in the past 2 days, right? It's a safe place, relatively spoken. It has it's not so dense. It has a public space. It has all of the things that other places in Brazil do not have any longer, and that's why there is any critique is happening on a high level. This, just to be said in advance. I think it is worthwhile, in order to understand the meaning of this place, even today, a place that's 50 years old, and I think where we only have to discuss at the moment issues of preservation and issues of urban renovation, because it is a question of how to treat this place. Is it just a gigantic piece of architecture? Is it sort of one of the large projects that we talk about in modernism, or is it let's say, a city that wants to take on its own life? It is definitely a place that, or a city that, one of the last foundations of foundations of a city. Every project after, is a big project. Is, let's say, a project that, you could say the Docklands or whatever. There is a different type of foundation of a city. You could also, talk about then as a next step about Celebration by Walt Disney Company or so. These are then the kind of the entities. So the three people, let's say the Brazilian red pack behind the Brasilia is Lucio Costa, Oscar Niemeyer, and Roberto Burle Marx. They met during this project, the work at the Ministry of Health. Lucio Costa, the thoughtful, the strategic, the diplomatic, the political. Niemeyer, the young Hotspur, sort of the architect, who is also interested in industrial design, picks up form, fast, elegant person. The Burle Marx, the person who probably is the most overlooked recently in regard to his role about Brazilianness, what is sort of this special Brazilian metonymy, sort of the swinging forms, probably the person with the most artistic approach and sort of with the most knowledgeable about the cultural transition, sort of as a combining sort of the let's say the indigenous culture with sort of modern industrial design questions. Burle Marx, in his own home, so he was a very wealthy, of wealthy upbringing. He could be independent. He bought an enormous piece of land where he collected all the tropical species or plants that he could get hold of, and he also has that kind of complete set of buildings, sort of from the colonial period to sort of adapted modern forms. He did his own studio. He painted. He landscaped, he did small projects. And when you look at sort of the collection of art that he was able to bring together at this compound near Rio de Janeiro, you see a lot of the elements that, for example, later on Lina Bobardi, sort of tried to bring into her work, or also Brazil Arquitectura. So these are all images sort of from his compound. And they, of course, speak a lot about sort of his interest and his light hand to combine, also to internalize landscape and to externalize architecture. And sort of all these structures or all these spatial configurations you find, of course, later on in all the projects, sort of the villas, the private houses in Sao Paulo and Rio, and of course also in the government buildings in Brasilia. And of course he has that eye, sort of to celebrate and to exhibit trees or plants and like objects and like the main actors in a scene. So, of course, they were also the ones who were exported. Sort of 1939, the World Exhibition in New York, I think, an absolutely important event. From then on, sort of Niemeyer, Costa, and so on, they worked abroad. All three of them were the darlings of the American society. And this World Expo, of course, is also a really, really, really important moment for urban design. We tend to forget that sort of the two, there were two pavilions, and sort of these were the official sort of the hemisphere and the obelisk, and in this ball, or in this hemisphere, sort of there was an exhibition of democracy. And of course, that was sort of based on Frank Lloyd Wright's writings on the modern city, the disappearing city. It was also sponsored by the car industry, and there was a lot of attention, especially for this new let's say, urban lifestyle and this sort of where are cities going. The Brazil Pavilion got a lot of applause, as it was one of the most spectacular pavilions. I think as Lucio Costa, sort of this quote shows how they really tried, or how they knew how to handle this kind of exhibition situation, and how sort of this building, sort of was really on spot, with its exhibiting or with its performing qualities. Next to it was also another privately sponsored pavilion, Norman Bel Geddes, the famous industrial designer, exhibiting sort of another model of a city, Futurama, sort of a pavilion sponsored by General Motors, and a very, also very, very modern use of these soft and curving streamline forms. And so all this, of course, is sort of the kind of industrial design that we know from the United States at the time. So Futurama these are details from the model, sort of is, of course, the car-based city, sort of tall buildings, fluid forms, details of the model, sort of the street, car-driven concept of a city. So, of course, sort of later on, we should not forget, sort of Niemeyer, sort of he had the chance in Latin America to build in the city, sort of these tall buildings, the vertical buildings, very muscular, very, very energetic buildings. And then, of course, the Copan in Sao Paulo as the kind of, let's say, the crown of this movement. At the same time, he was also training himself, you know, sort of on the sort of, this is the kind of modernism as a style and the curving forms and sort of Pamplona, the kind of the Pampulia. That's a, yeah. Makes a good, lost in translation, as I said. So there is this kind of, he is, as a sort of, he's at the peak of his creativity and of his vocabulary, I think, when Brasilia starts. Costa, he is interested, you know, sort of in the, let's say, the morphological, the structural debate. He's looking at the block and how, you know, sort of the block transforms, and he's looking at the sort of the density and sort of he's in this as a very much, of course, involved also in the debate that Le Corbusier is bringing to the global debate. The size of the block, the dissolution of the block, and Costa is at that time already you know, looking at the, not the super block or not at the, so he's breaking down the habitation or the kind of the big project that Corbusier is dreaming about. Sort of, this is the Kinle Park in Rio de Janeiro, where he's also working, you know, sort of with the louvers and with this kind of filter, the screen, and trying to find a typical Brazilian house. So that's why this plan actually is quite interesting, because sort of it combines a kind of a very, let's say, traditional concept of the block. Also he really believes in the block system for the residential, and then the monumental axis that works actually like an exhibition space. It is sort of, you know, so they of course it had to be built fast, and so you would really use sort of the concept of an exhibition space of a field, and then sort of that's the kind of the functional layer. So you have the monumental axis, you have next to it 4 quadrants for hotels, business districts, etc. Then you have the 2 wings for the residential, and then you have a leisure zone around with the special institutions, as with the embassies, the university, and other things. So this is one of the latest projects. In the cultural district, the National Museum, and opposite is the library. And of course, sort of these projects, as here, there is the appraisal about these buildings has been made. Sort of, it's a question of how they will be maintained, how to keep up with them, and how much preservation the city will apply to it. As sort of how many more architects will be allowed to build there. So that is the kind of we all know that sort of the Congress, but if you see sort of those images, and when you think sort of how this is really meant as to be spectacular, to be seen as a kind of, it's using the tools of an exhibition. That's looking the other side, the other way. Of course, you know, sort of they were all impressed by the skies in Brazil. In Brasilia especially, as sort of if there is a rain front coming, it's just spectacular. As you can see it coming for 30 minutes, and it's really spectacular. So the ministry buildings, and then of course also sort of this kind of using a screen facade in order to heighten the monumentality, and then yeah, sort of. You know, there is no individual expression, it's just sort of, so, but you can also see already what's the problem today, it's the cars. So the presidential palace, here you see again sort of some of the skies. very, also the buildings are all made, you know, sort of to be seen from a distance and to dissolve in the context. This is a very recent image. That's the Supreme Court across the Palacio del Planalto, and then here you see how really raw, simple, and really basic the projects are, and that's part of their charm. As I've never seen better government buildings in a way, as sort of very humble, very functional, very you know, sort of not just really very not overtaking, and with very simple elements, sort of this stair. And little moments, sort of always this landscape, this internalized landscape that creates, you know, sort of in every building there is sort of this moment as where you have that kind of openness, as a sort of on the ground floor, sort of that the building seems to be a building without gates, and then there is there are always these moments where sort of the levels are interlocked. And then all the buildings are placed in a kind of a pool, sort of no security zone, or this kind of distance that is not made, not created by a fence or anything. So that works spectacularly well. That is the Itamaraty Palace with a roof garden. Again, you know, sort of the nature that is part of that roof garden, and makes the buildings very, very accessible. One of the most interesting buildings and sort of really spectacular buildings I didn't know about before I went there is the university, the School of Architecture, actually, as a very brutal, long sort of building that has this kind of, it's just a concrete structure with the nature doing the rest. So you have this open, you have an open corridor in the middle, an open courtyard, and then you have open corridors that directly access the seminar rooms. Different views. And of course, sort of, I think that is probably Niemeyer's most important contribution, not only in Pampulha, but also here, is his church building, his sacred, his religious spaces, which add a totally new layer to the new tone to the services. And that is a project that I think is the planning department in, I'm not sure, probably the Brazilians have to correct me, which has this notion of this really enclosed courtyard. Also it's a block and has a slightly different screen than the others. So the real problem or the real challenge in Brasilia are the residential sectors. They are, as one block is 300 by 300 meters. That was sort of the concept of Costa, very, very small sketch or very raw sketch. 4 blocks always form a neighborhood. The blocks should be surrounded by green space, also by trees, because the wind in Brasilia is really strong. Then you have a couple of bar buildings which are connected by something that organizes parking and the cars, and then in the back you have a little bit of private space, green stuff and so on, and then in one corner you have a the possibility for infrastructure. In the center, sort of the middle street is used to access the 4 blocks, and then every second street, connecting street, is used for commercial, for the kind of retail that you need to support that neighborhood. Sort of 300 by 300 meters, as 2 blocks or one of these quarters is like half a kilometer, 3/4 of a kilometer. That is a detailed sketch for one of those blocks. So the perimeter is organized by trees. This is, sort of how the whole city is then organized, as a little bit like an airport. I did 2008. I did a studio with my students on one of the last empty blocks in one of the residential sectors. So this is the empty block. You can see this is how sort of one of the super quadras should work. Sort of you have that ring of trees around it, sort of very dense. And that organizes privacy. And then, when you get closer, you have these buildings on pilotis. This is sort of one of the questions in Brasilia is sort of the public space and how it works. And of course, the public space in Brasilia works okay, as a sort of in the residential sectors. There is the typical problem of how to organize the border between the building and the pedestrian sidewalk, and that there is no rule sort of that works depending on the neighborhood, but there is a problem with the topography, because as Brasilia actually has a pretty strong topography, and that is sort of not taken into account. And what you then realize is that there is a landscape architect missing, and so one wonders what happened, sort of to that tradition that is so characteristic for Brazilian places, that the landscape is equal to the plan, or equal in plan, and that makes Brasilia a little heavy-handed, and sort of these are all images of the, so this is how it should be, open, and then you have an interior courtyard. The pedestrian traffic through the blocks is okay, but the blocks are very empty. It's us. And of course, as here you see also the problem with the topography and the unresolved parking, because it's all surface parking, and that is growing and growing and growing, and the sort of there are no facilities really to address that problem. And then also again sort of topography, and that you have basically an untreated forest in the blocks. Then you have wide areas sort of reserved for the traffic. Pedestrians look for their own way. Sort of they are as pedestrians are not part of that, not really part of that concept of Brasilia. Sorry. And then you have that problem of you have the little retail streets, which are of course very much needed, but the architectural quality there is not very good. And then you have sort of moments of infrastructure like this chapel or the kindergarten. So the problems, or sort of the tasks that Brasilia should take on, besides, you know, sort of that UNESCO problem of, or this UNESCO task that how do you deal with Niemeyer's building and so on, and how are they maintained? I think that is not so much of our concern, because these are all government buildings, and sort of they will be taken care of. It's the question of how do you update and upgrade sort of the residential districts, and how do you introduce a landscape concept to the main areas. I will, you know, sort of just to show you a couple of figures. As of the density, Brasilia is 400 inhabitants per square kilometer. Sao Paulo and Rio, that I found this measure for Pamplona today in the Wikipedia. I almost couldn't believe it. I think it's more as a sort of, maybe you have to update your Wikipedia information, or it is really sort of, you are sort of like a exemplary community here. But as a Brasilia, you know, sort of is, as I said, a luxurious problem in a way, because it's as a 400, it's not, that is not something that you would find in any other Brazilian city. The problem, you know, sort of on the long, also in the scale here, is sort of this vast monumental space. Is this something, you know, sort of that wants to be carried on? There is a kind of a, you know, so where is that energy, that sort of this early, sort of from the early years, sort of a Burle Marx, you know, sort of a kind of a concept that really takes into account this chance for a public space here, because it's just open space. Plus, you know, we walked as pedestrians, and it's like, you can't do it. As you have to do even small distances, you have to drive. This is, you know, sort of, it's a recent image of the central space. Maybe Brasilia, you know, is very modern, contemporary these days, because it is very photogenic, it's good for mass events, you know, so if you can, also it can accommodate a lot of people at once, but you have, there is a need to do something here. Then this is one of my favorite objects. You see the, sort of that mirrored facade next to the Supreme Court, sort of that is an extension to the monumental district. Of course, it's kind of disguised with a mirrored facade. I think it's a Niemeyer building as well. So he was contradicting himself, because they needed this object, but sort of this is the kind of danger and that happens. Then there are all these informal markets and stuff that happens, you know, so this kind of, what kind of criteria are there, you know, so how ugly can it be and you don't see it, you know, so there is of course a necessity for quality control, and then there are these wide open spaces that need a debate, that need just, you know, sort of a concept, a lot of new interventions, smaller projects, just to make that city as energetic and as contemporary as all the other projects that we've seen in the first presentation, for example. I think that this city is too good, you know, sort of, and too much of an exhibition space, that it should not be updated. And we have, at the moment, we have so many projects, you know, sort of like, if it's the project in Mexico, sort of where you have objects in a park, or in Mongolia, or wherever, sort of where everywhere sort of there is a need to, or where architects go into the field and into the territory. And I think Brasilia would be a wonderful, or an appropriate location to take that concept one step further. And so here I'm concluding, this is not a project in Brasilia, this is in the center of Berlin. That's the square of the United Nations, sort of, that's where the large Karl Marx statue was placed. And, you know, so we all tackle with the same kind of issues, architectural issues also, how to maybe change a little bit sort of the monotony of those facades or of those blocks, because the society has changed and sort of people living there have changed. And so that's also a question for Brasilia, you know, sort of how to maybe slightly adjust the architecture. So thank you very much for your